The wind was cold that morning when Thomas Hale rode into the small frontier village. The sky was gray and the ground was covered with dry dust that swirled around his horse's hooves. Thomas was a rancher, known across 3 towns for his wide lands, strong horses, and his fair but firm nature. He had built everything with his own hands. He wasn't the kind of man to smile easily, but he was respected. When he came into town, people usually greeted him with quiet nods. This time, he wasn't here for business or kindness. He was here to collect a debt. A man named Caleb owed him for a horse feed and some winter supplies. Caleb had promised to pay within a few months, but nearly a year had passed. Thomas had given him time, hoping the man would make things right. But now it was time to settle it. He rode until he reached the far edge of the settlement, where a small cabin stood alone, half hidden behind dry bushes. The roof looked broken, the fence was falling apart, and smoke no longer rose from the chimney. Thomas frowned as he dismounted. He tied his horse to a post and walked to the door. He knocked once, twice. At first, there was silence. Then a small sound came from inside, a child's voice followed by soft footsteps. The door creaked open and a woman stood there. She was native, young, with long black hair that fell loose over her shoulders. Her dark eyes looked tired but calm. She held a small boy in her arms, maybe 3 or 4 years old. Her clothes were old, patched in many places, but clean. "Good morning," Thomas said, removing his hat politely. "I'm looking for Caleb." The woman hesitated. Her voice was quiet but clear. "He is gone." Thomas looked confused. "Gone where?" "North," she said. "He went last winter with a work camp. The men said he caught the fever. He did not come back." Thomas was silent for a moment. The wind whistled through the cracks in the cabin walls. Inside, he could see almost nothing, no food, no tools, only a blanket on the floor. The child in her arms was thin, his face pale. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry to hear that. But he owed me money. I came for what's due." The woman looked at him sadly. "I have nothing. No animals, no money. Only my son in my hands." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He looked around again, seeing the truth in what she said. The place was empty. She wasn't lying. He could have turned around and left, written the loss in his ledger, but something about the sight of her, standing proud even in hardship, made him stay still. He spoke more softly now. "You must have family somewhere." She shook her head. "No one left. I was from a tribe far from here. When I married Caleb, I came with him. Then he died, and the tribe will not take me back." Thomas nodded slowly. He could see how much she had lost. "What's your name?" "Lena," she said. "My boy's name is Samuel." He looked at the child, who was watching him quietly, holding a small wooden toy that was broken at the arm. Thomas sighed. He knew he couldn't take food or animals from her. There was nothing to take. But he couldn't ignore the debt either. It wasn't about money. It was about fairness. People respected him because he treated everyone the same. Still, something in his chest told him this was different. "I can't take what you don't have," he said slowly. "But debts can be worked off." Lena looked up quickly. "Worked? You can come to my ranch," he said. "Help around the place. There's cooking, cleaning, horses to feed. You'll earn back what Caleb owed. When it's done, you can go if you want." Her lips trembled slightly. "You mean we won't be left here?" "No," he said simply. Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Then we will come," he nodded. "Get what you need. We leave before sunset." She didn't have much to pack, a small pot, a blanket, a tiny wooden carving, and a few clothes. When she stepped outside, the child clung to her tightly. Thomas lifted them onto his horse and mounted in front. The road stretched wide before them, and the air grew colder as they rode toward the hills. For hours, neither spoke much. Lena looked around, taking in the open land, the tall grass bending in the wind, and the sound of distant birds. Samuel leaned against her, half asleep. Thomas rode steadily, his eyes fixed on the horizon. When the sun began to set, they reached a rise overlooking a vast valley. Below them was Thomas's ranch, a wide stretch of land with hundreds of cattle, a large barn, and a big wooden house surrounded by fences. The orange light of the sunset touched everything, making it glow softly. "This is my place," Thomas said. "You'll stay in the small cabin behind the barn. It's dry and safe. You'll start work in the morning." Lena looked down at the land, amazed. It was larger than any place she had ever seen. She nodded. "Thank you." That night she made a small fire in the cabin and warmed soup Thomas had sent with one of his men. It was the first warm meal she and Samuel had eaten in days. As her son slept, Lena sat by the small window and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. Outside, Thomas stood near the fence, watching the small glow of her cabin. He told himself it was only duty that made him think of her, but deep inside he knew it was something more. The next days passed quickly. Lena worked from dawn to dusk. She helped in the kitchen, cleaned the main house, and even helped feed the animals. The ranch hands noticed how quietly and carefully she worked. She never wasted a word, never complained, even when her hands turned red from the cold water. Thomas watched her sometimes from a distance. He saw how she smiled at her son, how she sang softly in her language while working. There was peace in her voice. One morning he found Samuel playing with a small puppy near the stables, laughing in a way that filled the quiet air. Thomas couldn't help but smile. "Your boy's got a good heart," he said. Lena nodded shyly. "He reminds me that life is still kind." As the weeks passed, the ranch began to feel different. The workers seemed happier. The boy ran through the fields. Even Thomas, who had always lived in silence, started to notice the beauty of the mornings again. The sound of birds, the way sunlight touched the hills. Then one evening, a storm came suddenly. The wind howled and the rain began to pour heavily. Thomas saw Lena outside, rushing to bring in the clothes from the line. He ran toward her, shouting over the rain, "Leave it! You'll get soaked." But she shook her head. "These are all we have." Together they fought the storm, gathering the clothes and running for shelter. By the time they reached the porch, both were drenched, laughing breathlessly. For a moment they just looked at each other. Her hair clung to her face, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Thomas's heart beat strangely fast. He didn't say anything, but he couldn't look away. "Thank you," she said softly. He cleared his throat, looking away. "You did all the work." They stood in silence for a long second as the rain drummed against the roof. Something unspoken passed between them, something neither could name. That night, Thomas lay awake. He had come to collect a debt. He thought it would be simple, a deal, a number, an end. But now he couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the small cabin and the child who had laughed in the rain. He realized that maybe, for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone anymore. The next morning after the storm, the sky was clear and blue. The air smelled fresh and the grass sparkled with drops of water. Thomas woke early and looked out over his ranch. Everything was calm again, but his thoughts were not. He kept thinking about Lena. Something about her had changed the silence in his house. It wasn't just her presence, it was the feeling that his world had become warmer somehow. He went to the barn where she was already working. She was feeding the horses, humming softly to her son who sat on a hay bale nearby. When Thomas entered, she stopped and turned, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You work too early," he said gently. She smiled a little. "The horses wake with the sun. They don't wait." Her calm answer made him smile back without realizing it. "You're right, but you don't have to do everything alone. I can have someone help you." "I am used to work," she said quietly. "It keeps my heart steady." Thomas didn't reply. He watched her for a moment longer, and then turned to help her carry a heavy sack of feed. Together they worked in silence, the only sound being the movement of animals and the rustling of straw. There was something peaceful in the quiet between them. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a steady rhythm. Lena cooked, cleaned, and helped care for the ranch hands when they were injured or sick. Samuel followed her everywhere, sometimes playing with the ranch dogs, sometimes sitting by Thomas's porch drawing lines in the dust with a stick. Thomas grew fond of the boy. One evening, he found Samuel waiting near the stable with a small wooden carving in his hands. "I made this for you," the boy said, shyly holding it out. It was rough but shaped like a horse. Thomas took it carefully. "You made this?" Samuel nodded proudly. "Mama said you have many horses, so I made one for you." Thomas smiled. "Then this one will stay in my office. You have a good hand, son." The boy's eyes lit up. He ran to tell his mother, and when Thomas saw her smile, something in him softened completely. That night, Thomas sat by his fire, holding the carving in his hand. It wasn't worth money or gold, but it felt like the most precious thing he owned. As spring turned to summer, the ranch flourished. The cattle were healthy, and the fields turned green again. Thomas had more help now that Lena was around. But more than that, he felt a quiet peace in his home that he hadn't known for years. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, Thomas found Lena by the river that ran through the back of his land. She was washing clothes, her feet in the cool water, while Samuel played nearby. The golden light made everything shine softly. He walked closer, his boots crunching over stones. "You shouldn't work after sunset," he said. She looked up. "I like the river. It reminds me of home. I used to sit by water like this when I was a child." He sat on a rock near her, watching the slow movement of the river. "Do you miss it?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Sometimes. But I think the spirits lead us where we must go. I lost my husband, but I found a place where my boy can laugh again. Maybe that is the way life repays sorrow." Thomas listened quietly. Her words were simple, but they carried wisdom. "You speak like someone who's seen more than most," he said. She smiled faintly. "Life teaches everyone. Some listen, some don't." They sat in silence for a while. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers, and Samuel's laughter echoed across the water. When Thomas looked at her, he realized how much she had changed his world without even trying. In the days that followed, people in town began to notice too. When Thomas went to the supply store, folks said the ranch seemed brighter lately. He only smiled and said little. Inside, he knew why. But the peace didn't last forever. One afternoon, a man rode up to the ranch wearing a dusty hat and a crooked grin. Thomas recognized him immediately. It was Caleb's brother, Owen. He dismounted and came forward with a hard look in his eyes. "I heard you took my brother's woman," he said roughly. "You think you can just take her like some debt payment?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Watch your words, Owen. She's here of her own choice. She works and earns her stay. That's more than you've ever done." Owen spat on the ground. "You rich men always think you can buy everything. Well, I came to take her back." Lena stepped out of the barn holding her son's hand. She froze when she saw Owen. Her face went pale, but she stood straight. "You have no right," she said quietly. "You never cared for me or for your brother's child," Owen sneered. "You belong with your people, not here pretending you're one of them." Thomas stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "She belongs where she is treated with respect. And that's here." For a moment the air was tense. Owen looked from Lena to Thomas, his pride fighting his fear. Then he muttered something under his breath, turned, and rode away. Lena trembled slightly as the sound of hooves faded. Thomas turned to her. "Are you all right?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, thank you." He shook his head. "You shouldn't have to thank me for protecting what's right." That night she came to the porch after putting Samuel to bed. The moon was full and the air was still. She stood beside Thomas, her voice quiet. "You didn't have to stand for me like that." He looked at her. "Yes, I did." There was a long silence. The wind brushed against them, and in that quiet moment, both knew something had changed forever. The next morning, Thomas went to town and spoke to the local clerk. When he returned, he handed Lena a small folded paper. "This says the debt is paid in full. You don't owe me anything now." She looked at the paper, then at him. "And what if I still want to stay?" He hesitated. "Then you stay, not because of debt, but because it's your home now." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled. "Then we will stay." Days turned to months. Samuel grew stronger, running through the fields like any ranch boy. Lena continued her work, but now she laughed more often, sang louder, and sometimes joined the ranch hands for supper outside under the stars. Thomas would sit nearby, watching the light on her face and feel something deep and peaceful inside his heart. One evening, a strong storm rolled over the land again. Lightning flashed, and thunder shook the valley. The animals grew restless, and everyone hurried to the barns to keep them calm. Lena helped without fear, working beside Thomas through the rain. When it was over, they stood together, soaked but smiling. "You're not afraid of storms anymore," he said. She looked at him and answered softly, "Not when someone stands beside me." Thomas smiled, his heart full. He knew then what he had been feeling all along. She had come into his life because of a debt, but what she brought could never be measured in money. She had given him warmth, laughter, and peace. Months later, when the first snow began to fall, the ranch looked quiet and bright. Inside the main house, Samuel sat by the fire carving small wooden horses. Lena was setting food on the table. Thomas watched them both, the glow of the fire reflecting in his eyes. He remembered the day he had ridden into that broken cabin, thinking only of collecting what was owed. He never imagined that debt would lead him to the family he never knew he needed. Lena looked up and met his eyes. Her smile was soft, filled with trust. Thomas walked over and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Lena," he said quietly, "you and Samuel have made this place feel like home again." She looked at him, her eyes shining. "It was always meant to be, Thomas. Sometimes we find what we need when we least expect it." Outside, the snow fell slowly, covering the earth in white. The ranch stood peaceful under the winter sky, and for the first time in many years, Thomas Hale felt whole. The debt had long been paid, but the love and life it brought would last forever.